The chain was long enough to let her breathe. That was what Wren kept telling herself, crouched in the hollow between two ash roots with her wrists locked behind her and the iron biting through the sleeve of her tunic into skin already raw from the last 3 hours of cold. Long enough to breathe, not long enough to run, which was the point. Which was entirely the point, because she had put it there herself. She had fastened the other end around the root before she clicked the lock shut on her own wrists, working the mechanism with her fingers reversed, a skill she had practiced in the dark of her sleeping mat for 6 nights until she could manage it in under 40 seconds. 40 seconds. She had done it in 31 this morning, which was good, because when she heard them coming through the birchwood, she had needed every spare second to get herself arranged convincingly. Knees in the frost, chin down, the picture of someone too frightened to run, rather than someone who had chosen not to. The hunters were not looking for her. That was the first thing to understand. They had come up from the valley in a column of 9, and they were looking for the den. Wren knew where the den was. She had known for 4 days, ever since she had tracked the small set of prints through the snowmelt behind the mill, too large to be a dog's, too delicate to be a full pack wolf's, pressed in a pattern she recognized from her mother's old field notes as the gait of a very young wolf, not yet at full bone density, perhaps 8 weeks old, perhaps 10. She had followed the trail without allowing herself to decide anything. She had simply followed, the way her mother had taught her to follow, a wound sent through underbrush, not with intention, only with attention. The trail ended at the base of a limestone outcrop, 3/4 of a mile north of the pack's border markers, beneath an overhang that smelled powerfully of cedar resin and dry earth, and something else, something that had made her stop walking and stand very still. She had not gone closer. She had stood at the edge of smelling range, catalogued what she could, and left the way she had come, pressing her boot prints back into their own impressions so the trail looked like one set of tracks instead of 2. She had told no one. She was not in the habit of being believed. Wren was the pack's record keeper, which was a title that sounded like importance and functioned like invisibility. She sat in the back of every council meeting and transcribed the decisions of wolves who did not look at her when she spoke. She was 23 years old and an omega, in a border pack that prized speed and size and the kind of loud hierarchical certainty she had never been able to produce. She had been overlooked so consistently and for so long that she had stopped experiencing it as injury and had begun, without quite meaning to use it as a tool. No one watched the record keeper. No one asked the record keeper where she had been or what she had seen. No one assumed the record keeper had seen anything worth asking about. She had seen the hunters twice before in her life. Both times they had come for wolves. Both times the pack's sentinels had driven them back at the border, with losses on both sides that Wren had recorded in precise, neutral language in the council ledger, and both times the entry had felt like writing a grave marker with ink. She understood what they were and what they carried, the iron chains, the silver-tipped arrows, the flat-eyed certainty of people who believed they were solving a problem. They did not distinguish between an 8-week wolf pup, too small to lift its own head, and any other wolf. That was not a distinction they considered relevant. She had considered her options carefully over 4 days, the way she considered most things, alone, at night, sitting with her back against the wall of her small quarters, and her hands folded in her lap, and her mother's field notes open on the floor beside her. She had 3 choices, as far as she could count them. She could report the den's location to the pack sentinels and let pack politics determine whether the pup was protected or surrendered in some larger negotiation she would have no voice in. She could do nothing and trust that the hunters would not find the outcrop on their own, or she could lead the hunters somewhere else. She had looked at the field notes for a long time. Then she had closed them. The hollow between the ash roots was her own choice, made on her own authority, with no one's permission. It was located 2 miles south-southeast of the limestone outcrop, far enough to be genuinely misleading, Positioned along a creek bed, the hunters would read as a natural travel corridor. She had scuffed the approach trail convincingly. She had left a scrap of her own tunic on a branch 50 yards out, at nose height, because she knew they used dogs, and she knew the dogs would lock onto her omega scent and pull their handlers forward with a conviction that would read as truth. The chain was iron. She had chosen iron deliberately because silver would have been genuinely dangerous, and because iron against skin produced exactly the kind of distress scent that made the dogs credible. She had been sitting in it for 3 hours when she heard the first branch crack. Wren pressed her chin toward her chest and let her breathing go shallow, and she did not think about whether this would work. She thought about the overhang. She thought about the smell of cedar resin and dry earth, and what had lain underneath it, something milky and warm and very small. She thought, this is enough of a reason. The first hunter stepped into the clearing, and she did not look up. That was 6 hours ago, 6 hours and 43 minutes, because she had counted the minutes by the light. 3 days before that, 3 days and what felt like a different life, though in practice it was only the same narrow life she had always lived, seen from a different angle. Wren had been sitting in the back of the council chamber with her writing board across her knees, transcribing a debate about grain stores that had been going on for the better part of 2 hours, when one of the senior sentinels had come through the door with snow still in his hair and said flatly that a column of hunters had been spotted at the lower pass. The council had argued for 40 minutes about the appropriate response. Wren had written down every word. She had also written, in very small letters in the margin where no one would look, the words they did not say, that 3 of the pack's border wolves had already been taken in the last month, that the hunting column this season was larger than any in the prior 6 years, that the pack's treaty obligations meant the Alpha King of the Northern Territory, whose jurisdiction technically extended to this borderland, had not yet been formally asked for assistance, because the pack's elder, a wolf named Corvin, who had governed this territory for 22 years and whose primary motivation was the preservation of his own authority, would rather lose wolves than ask for help from a king he resented. Wren had written it all down. No one read the margins. She had gone home that night and opened her mother's field notes to the section on limestone formations in the northern range, and she had read the entry twice, and then she had done the thing she always did when she was trying to think. She had lain on her back on the floor, with her eyes open and her hands flat against the cold stone, and let the information arrange itself without pushing it. Her mother had been a field naturalist, a wolf reader, the pack had called her, with a mix of respect and unease that Wren had noticed even as a child and learned to understand only in retrospect. Her mother had been an Omega too, and she had moved through the world the way Wren had learned to move through it, quietly, precisely, with a degree of attention that did not require an audience. She had died when Wren was 14, a fever in a bad winter, and she had left Wren her field notes and her compass and a particular way of looking at a problem that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with what was actually in front of you. What was in front of Wren, when she was honest, was this. The pup at the limestone outcrop was alone. She had found no adult prints at the site on any of her 4 visits. Whatever bond had connected that pup to a parent or pack guardian had been severed by something she could not determine: illness, injury, panic, death. The pup was alone and small and had a scent that carried, and the hunting column was moving north with dogs that were trained to follow exactly that kind of scent. It was a question of time and direction, and whether she was willing to alter the second to change the third. She had been willing. The morning of the 6th day, the day she had gone out before dawn with the chain in the bottom of her field sack, Corvin had called another council session, and Wren had sat in the back and transcribed, and one of the junior sentinels had mentioned, almost in passing, that the Alpha King Theron of the Northern Range had sent a scouting party southward in the last week, drawn by reports of hunter activity in the borderlands. Corvin had dismissed this with a wave of his hand. The Alpha King's interest in their territorial issues was presumptuous, he had said. They were capable of managing their own borders without northern interference. Wren had written that down too. She had also written, in the margin, "The scouting party will not know to look for the den. No one would tell them. Corvin would not. The sentinels who reported to Corvin would not." And Wren's voice in a council chamber had the weight of a reed falling on water. So she had gone out with the chain instead. The hunters had found her in the hollow, exactly as she had planned. They had circled her twice, their dogs straining on the leads, pulling toward her wrists, where the iron had broken the skin enough to produce the sharp, sour note that hunting dogs were trained to follow. The lead hunter, a broad-shouldered man in oiled leather, with a long-handled silver implement slung across his back, had crouched in front of her and asked her, in a flat voice, who had chained her and why. Wren had looked at him with what she hoped was adequate blankness and said she did not know. He had asked if she knew where the wolf den was. She had said she had heard there was something in the eastern wood, past the dry creek bed, maybe 3 miles out. She had said it uncertainly, the way someone says something uncertain, and she had let her hands shake against the chain for emphasis, which was not entirely performance, because the cold had been in her fingers for 2 hours by then. The lead hunter had looked at her for a long moment. He had looked at his dogs, who were still pulling toward her wrists and not toward the north, which confirmed the scent trail they had been following was hers, and that the story was consistent. Then he had stood and told 2 of his men to stay with her and had taken the rest of the column east, toward the dry creek bed, toward the story she had given him. 2 men, iron chain, a clearing in a birch wood that was getting colder as the sun moved west. The 2 guards were not cruel to her. They were indifferent, which in her experience was worse in some ways and better in others. They sat on opposite sides of the clearing, with their weapons across their knees, and they did not speak to each other or to her. One of them had given her a piece of dried meat at some point in the 2nd hour, holding it out without comment, and she had taken it because she needed the sustenance, and she was not in a position to refuse food on principle. She ate it and waited. She kept her breathing slow. She thought about east and 3 miles, and how long it would take 9 men to reach a dry creek bed, and realized there was nothing there, and turn back. She calculated she had somewhere between 1 hour and 2. 1 hour, if the lead hunter was experienced and efficient, and read empty terrain quickly. 2, if he was the kind of man who needed to cover every yard of ground before he accepted a negative result. She estimated, from the cut of his coat and the way he had crouched, fluid, practiced, not a man who second-guessed himself much, that she had closer to 1. The cold was no longer simply cold. It had moved past the sensation of temperature into something structural, a weight in the bones of her knees and a stiffness in her fingers that made her aware, practically and without drama, that she would not be able to work the lock mechanism on the chain if the temperature dropped another 3 degrees before she needed to. She had accounted for this in her planning, the way she accounted for most things, not by eliminating the risk, but by knowing it was there and deciding it was acceptable. It was still acceptable, just. The wind shifted. She felt it before she registered what it meant, a slight turning of the air from the north-northwest, carrying a cold she recognized as higher elevation, the kind of cold that came down off the peaks of the northern range rather than out of the valley. It pushed against the side of her face and moved the loose hair at her temple, and then, a half-second later, she heard the change in the guards. She did not look up. She kept her chin down and her hands still. But she heard it, one of them shifting his weight on the root where he sat, a boot scraping frost, and then a stillness that was different from the previous stillness, a stillness with a tension in it. The second guard made a sound low in his chest. Not a word, not a signal she could name. Something older than either. The wind was coming from the north-northwest. and something was coming with it, and the two hunters in this clearing, human men, who used dogs because their own noses were insufficient, still felt it. Even they felt it. That told her something. That told her a great deal. Wren sat very still and measured the distance between one breath and the next, and she did not let herself feel what was rising in her chest, which was something she did not have a word for, that lived in the same register as the scent of cedar resin and dry earth, and the warm milk smell of a pup that was still alive under its limestone ledge 2 miles north. Something was coming. The wind said so. The guards said so with their bodies before their minds had caught up. She had perhaps 4 minutes before she found out whether what was coming was rescue or a different kind of danger. She decided 4 minutes was enough time to start working the lock. She had trained for 31 seconds. She had never trained with hands this cold. Theron had smelled it 20 minutes before he understood what he was smelling. He was moving south along the ridge above the birchwood, a route his scouting party had established 2 days ago, and which he was now covering alone, because the information had shifted in a way that made company inefficient. He had sent his 3 scouts ahead toward the border markers, and dropped back to check the secondary trail himself, which was a habit of his that his senior commander found frustrating, and which he continued because the secondary trails were where information lived that the primary trails did not. The wind had been from the northwest all morning. Then it shifted, and something came in on it that stopped him. It was not the hunter's scent, though he could read that too, iron and oil, and the chemical flatness of silver treatment on equipment, coming up from the wood below him. He had identified the hunting column's position within the first hour, and had been tracking it at distance since then, building a map of their movement in his head, estimating numbers, direction, intention. What came in on the shifted wind was different. It was below, and south, not north where the column had been heading. It was... He stopped moving and let himself simply breathe for a moment, which was something he rarely did in the field, because it looked like hesitation, and he could not afford the appearance of hesitation in front of his people. It was fear. Clean, unmistakable fear, the kind that had been going on for long enough to deepen into something compound, something that included cold and hunger and pain, all of it woven into a bass note that he placed as omega before he had consciously decided to analyze it. An omega, in the birchwood below him, not moving, chained. He knew the chain from the scent of it, old iron, the particular tang of metal that had sat against skin long enough for the two to exchange something. He knew the cold from the thin, flattened character of the fear scent, distress that had been sitting in low temperatures long enough to be compressed by it. He knew the hunger from the absence, the way a note that should have been fuller was not. And he knew something else, which arrived without his permission and without any precedent in 29 years of living in this particular body. Underneath the fear and the cold and the hunger, there was something that was not distress at all. There was a quality he had no word for in any language he spoke, which was the scent of someone who had accepted their situation absolutely, not defeated by it, but settled into it, the way water settles into the shape of its container. Someone who had put themselves in this position deliberately and was enduring it on purpose. His wolf said, with absolute certainty and no supporting argument, her. He did not pause on this. He did not examine it. He began moving south along the ridge at a pace that was faster than a walk and quieter than anything that speed should have produced, and his hands were entirely steady, and the only evidence of what was happening in his chest was a muscle in his jaw that had tightened and would not release. There were 2 human hunters in the clearing when he stepped out of the birch line, and then there was one, and then there was none, because what he had in his voice when he chose to use it was the kind of authority that did not require volume. He said once, "Leave," and they left, because there are things older than contracts and older than weapons, and the 2 men with iron chains and silver on their backs were not old enough, or certain enough, to stand in front of what they were facing. Then he looked at her. She had her chin down, her wrists were behind her, chained to an ash root, and the iron had marked both of them, not broken the skin deeply but enough, the kind of abrasion that would be sore for a week. Her knees were in the frost. Her hair was loose around her face, and there were leaves in it, and she was cold, the kind of cold that had gone structural, past shivering, into the deeper stillness of a body conserving its last reserves. She was also, he understood, within the first moment of looking at her, completely composed. Not stunned, not dissociative, present, watchful, reading him from beneath her lowered head with the precision of someone who had been reading situations quietly for a very long time. He had expected many things when the scent brought him here. He had not expected someone who looked back at him as though she were the one assessing whether he was safe. "Key," he said. He did not shout. He did not reach for her. He kept both hands visible at his sides, and he spoke at a register that carried without pressure. She looked at him for one full second. Then she said, "I have it. I can do it. My hands are cold." And her voice was steady, in a way that would have cost her something. He understood, and she spent it without hesitation. He said, "Let me," and moved behind her, and she stiffened, only slightly, the smallest brace in her shoulders, and then released it, which was a decision she made in real time in front of him, and he filed it away, alongside everything else, the chain she had put on herself, the position 2 miles south of where the hunting column had been heading, the scrap of tunic he had scented at 50 yards on his way in. She had drawn them here, away from something. He had been a king for 11 years and a wolf for 29, and he could count on one hand the number of people who had shown him this quality of deliberate, quiet sacrifice, and most of them had been his own generals. The lock was a simple mechanism, and he had it open in 7 seconds. The chain came free, and he held it so it did not fall against her wrists, and she pulled her hands forward and brought them to her chest and pressed them there, and the first sound she made that wasn't words was small and involuntary and told him exactly how much she had been holding. He came around to face her and crouched to her level and looked at her wrists, which she allowed, though her hands stayed against her chest, and she looked at his face, rather than at what he was examining, as if she was deciding something. "North-northwest," she said. "The limestone outcrop. There is a pup there, alone, I think 8 to 10 weeks. I have been by 4 times and seen no adult sign. The hunter's column went east on information I gave them, the dry creek bed. You have maybe 40 minutes before the lead man reads the terrain and turns back." Theron looked at her. "I know," she said, and something in her voice told him she was aware of exactly how the information landed, and that she had arranged it this way, the draw, the decoy, the precise coordinates delivered the moment she had a pair of hands she could trust, without ever assuming she would have a pair of hands she could trust. She had planned it as a closed loop. He was an addition she had not built into the original structure. He said, "Your name." She said, "Wren. I am the pack record keeper." A pause, small and dry. No one was going to tell you about the pup. He stood. He turned his head north-northwest and held very still for a moment, reading the wind, and found it, faint, under everything else, the warm milk thread of something young and small and alive under limestone. He could reach the outcrop in 12 minutes at a run. He could have his scouts there in 20. He turned back to her. "Can you stand?" She uncurled from her knees with a steadiness that was clearly costing her something she was not going to admit, and she stood, and her legs held. She was perhaps an inch shorter than he had estimated from crouching distance, and she had the stillest eyes he had ever seen on a living person. "Go," she said. "I will be fine. I have been fine." He looked at her for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he normally looked at anything when a situation required action, and then he put 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled, once, at a frequency that carried 2 ridges. His scouts would have his position in minutes. "You will not be left here," he said. She opened her mouth. He could see the shape of a protest forming, the automatic reflex of someone who was accustomed to being dismissed and had arranged their internal life around not needing to be attended to. He said, "I know. You would have been fine. You are still not being left here." She looked at him. The protest did not come out. She pressed her lips together and looked away, north-northwest, toward the limestone outcrop she could not see from here, and he watched the line of her jaw and the set of her shoulders, and understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with reason, and everything to do with the thing in his chest that had not loosened since the wind shifted, that she was going to be an argument he would spend a long time losing beautifully, and he found this did not trouble him at all. He went north at a run. The scouts came in from the east, and he redirected them without breaking stride, a series of signals exchanged at distance, and they converged on the limestone outcrop from 3 angles, in what was, in the end, 11 minutes rather than 12. The pup was exactly where Wren's coordinates had placed it, beneath the overhang, in a hollow between 2 roots not unlike the one she had chosen for herself, which struck him with a precision that felt like language. It was small. It was weak with cold and hunger. It was, he established within the first seconds, alive, its sides moving with the particular shallow, determined breathing of something that had not yet decided to stop. His scouts secured the perimeter. He had one of them, a wolf named Davin, who had grown up in a border pack and knew this kind of work. Wrap the pup in a dry outer layer and hold it against his body for warmth, while the other 2 read the surrounding terrain. There were no adult prints. There was no sign that anyone other than a small, light-footed person who had been extremely careful had been near this site in the past week. He stood at the edge of the overhang and looked at the indentations in the frost where Wren had knelt, 4 separate times by her own account, to read a trail she had not been sent to read, for a pup that was not her pack's responsibility. At personal risk she had factored into her planning as acceptable and had never mentioned to anyone. The hunting column was 2 miles east, reading an empty creek bed. He had perhaps 25 minutes before they turned. He sent Davin south with the pup and 1 additional scout and went back himself, at a run, because he had said she would not be left there, and he was a man who kept the things he said. She was upright when he returned, standing rather than kneeling, which meant the cold had receded enough in her legs to allow it. She had pulled her sleeve down over her wrists. She was looking south, in the direction the 2 guards had gone, with an expression he read as calculation. She was mapping the threat vectors, he realized. Even now, even with ice-stiff fingers and 3 hours of chain marks on her arms, she was mapping what came next. He said, "The pup is safe." She turned and looked at him, and something moved through her face, fast, involuntary, the kind of thing that does not wait for permission, and she nodded once. Her jaw was tight. He understood she was not going to make a sound about what that information meant to her, not in front of him, not yet, maybe not ever, and he understood this was not stoicism performed for his benefit, but simply the shape of how she carried things, and he filed it away with everything else. "My scouts are 2 minutes behind me," he said. "We are going north, to the holding camp at the ridge. The hunting column will not follow into Northern Range territory." She said, "I should go back to the pack. Corvin will need a report of the column's position and movement." "Corvin," Theron said, at a careful, even register, "will receive a message from my camp by nightfall. You are not going back into the borderland until the column has cleared the valley." She looked at him with the measuring quality he was beginning to recognize as her default state. "That is not your decision." "Wren," he said her name with the same care he had used for everything else, precisely, without pressure. "You have iron burns on both wrists, 2 degrees of cold injury in your fingers by the color of them, and 6 hours of exposure, in an unheated clearing. You sat in a chain for an Omega pup you found on your own and reported to no one because you knew no one would act on the information in time. He paused. I am making it my decision. The silence between them was the kind that had content in it. She said slowly, The pup. What was it? What lineage? He had known she would ask this, somehow. Northern Range, he said. The scent signature is clear. One of ours, separated in the last hunt disturbance 3 weeks ago. We had stopped looking. Wren was quiet for a moment. You had stopped looking, she repeated, and there was nothing in her voice except the fact, stated plainly, and it was more devastating for the absence of anything else. Yes, Theron said. He did not look away. She appeared to take this in with the same steady attention she applied to everything. Then she said, all right, meaning he understood, not agreement exactly, but a provisional suspension of the argument, which was the most he was likely to get from her at this stage, and was, he decided, enough. His scouts arrived. Davin was still holding the pup against his body, with the careful, practiced steadiness of a man who had done this before. The pup was warmer. He could tell from the slight change in its posture, the shift from the compressed stillness of cold to something marginally more relaxed, still weak, still requiring warmth and milk and time, but breathing with more depth. Wren looked at it from 6 feet away. Then she walked to Davin and held out her hands, and Davin looked at Theron, and Theron nodded, and Davin transferred the pup to her. She held it against her chest without fanfare, tucking it inside the outer layer of her coat, with an efficiency that said she had thought about how to do this before the moment arrived. The pup made a sound, barely a sound, more a vibration, the kind a very small animal makes when warmth reaches it, and Wren's eyes closed for 1 second, and then opened again, and she looked at Theron and said, I am ready to go. They walked north. The camp at the ridge was 4 miles and 2 hours, and Wren walked all of it without complaint, which was not a surprise to him by then. The pup slept against her chest. The cold was still in her fingers, and he could see it in the way she moved, the slight stiffness, but she did not slow down, and she did not ask for help, and he did not offer any, except to put himself on her windward side, which he did without comment, and which she registered and did not address. He told her, walking, about the Northern Range, not a prepared speech. He had not prepared anything. He told her about the hunt disturbance 3 weeks ago, what he knew, and what he did not know, where the gap in his own intelligence had been. He was not a man who found it easy to describe his failures, and the fact that he was doing it now, on a cold ridgeline with a woman he had known for less than 3 hours, was something he chose not to examine until later. It felt necessary. It felt like the correct thing to offer in return for what she had given, which was the honest accounting of what she had known, and how she had known it, and what she had done with that knowledge. She listened. She asked precise questions, the date of the disturbance, the number of wolves involved, the direction of the separation event. She was not asking idly. She was reconstructing something, building a timeline, cross-referencing information she already had against information he was supplying, and he watched her do it with the same quality of attention he would have given one of his strategists in a briefing room, which was not a comparison he had made about a person on a cold ridgeline before. The pup has been alone for at least 22 days, she said, at a point somewhere in the 2nd mile. Based on the entry conditions in the frost and the depth of the nest material, she has been gathering insulation for warmth, which pups that age do instinctively but not efficiently. 22 days is the low estimate. He said. Yes, the scent markers are consistent with female, though at this age it is preliminary. She glanced at him. Your scouts did not pick this up because they were looking for a wolf, not for pup sign. Pup sign is a different skill set. Where did you learn it? My mother's field notes. A pause. She was a wolf reader. She spent 11 years in the Northern Range before she came south. He looked at her profile in the low grey light of the late afternoon. What was her name? Wren was quiet for a moment. Merrin. The word landed in Theron's chest like a stone dropped in deep water. He recognized it. Merrin of the Northern Range, a name in the record archives of his own pack, a field naturalist whose notes on wolf behavior in limestone formation territories had been cited in 3 consecutive years of hunt management decisions. A name associated with a quality of attention and precision that his archivists had, on more than one occasion, described as extraordinary. He said nothing. He filed it, and he walked. The camp was warm. There were fires and sheltered structures, and wolves who looked at Wren with the particular quality of attention he was already beginning to associate with people encountering her for the first time. A slight recalibration, a silence before judgment settled, the sense of something that did not match the category they had prepared. He brought her to the main shelter and had food and warm water brought, and a pack healer examine her wrists, which she submitted to with the same provisional acceptance she had given everything since the birchwood. Not grateful, not resentful, simply present and practical. The healer, a sharp-eyed woman named Sella who had been with Theron's camp for 9 years and had opinions about most things, wrapped both wrists and looked at the pup, and then looked at Wren and said something to her, in a low voice, that Theron did not catch. Whatever Wren said back made Sella still for a moment. Then Sella nodded, once, with a quality of respect that Theron recognized from his own dealings with her and did not see her extend often. He crossed the shelter and said to Wren, "What did she ask you?" Wren was sitting with the pup in her lap now, the pup awake enough to be taking warm milk from a cloth Sella had soaked and offered. "She asked if I had known what I was doing when I went out this morning, whether I had understood the risk. And?" She looked at him steadily. "I told her I had done the math, that the risk to me was acceptable against the alternative." She paused. "She said I was either very brave or very foolish." "What did you say?" "I said those 2 things are not as different as people think." She looked down at the pup. "She is taking the milk. That is good. At this age, if they refuse milk, it becomes complicated." He stood and watched her for a moment. She had leaves still in her hair. Her wrists were wrapped, and her color was better than it had been on the ridgeline, and she was sitting in a Northern Range camp with a pup she had saved by putting iron around her own wrists and spending 6 hours in frozen ground. She was the most matter-of-fact person he had encountered in 11 years of kingship, which was a tenure that had not been gentle, and she was sitting there describing milk-taking in a pup with the same even attention she had given everything else. The word came again, quieter this time, no longer the wolf's blunt imperative, but something from him, his own, her. Not a question, not a demand, simply a recognition that had no precedent and required no action yet, only acknowledgement. He sat across from her and watched the pup drink and said, "Tell me about your mother's field notes, the limestone sections." She looked up. Something in her face shifted. Not surprise, exactly, but the quality of someone who had been looked past for so long that being looked at directly required a moment to process. "All of them?" she said. "Start wherever you want to," he said. "We have time." She started at the beginning. The hunting column cleared the valley on the 4th day, which was 1 day longer than Theron's estimate, but within his outer bound. In those 4 days, Wren did not return to the pack settlement. She remained at the ridge camp, which was her decision, and not a confinement. He had made that clear on the 1st day, had told her she was a guest, and that the word guest meant she left when she chose and stayed when she chose, and she had received this with the same measuring attention she gave everything, and had, each morning, chosen to stay. The pup, whom the camp had begun to call Pip, for a reason that traced back to Davin and a conversation Theron had not been present for, grew stronger in small, measurable increments. By the 2nd day, she was taking milk with more urgency. By the third, she was awake for longer intervals, regarding the world around her with the unfocused intensity of the very young. By the fourth, she had taken 3 complete meals from Wren's hands and had been moved to a proper nesting box lined with wool batting and cedar shavings, which she treated as hers. Wren tracked all of it in a small notebook she had produced from the inner pocket of her coat, a book that, Theron had noticed on the second morning, was not blank, but already contained extensive notes in small, precise handwriting. She had been keeping a record of the pup's condition from the first site visit. Before she had even decided to act, she had been documenting. The precision of it told him something about how her mind worked that no amount of direct questioning could have produced. He found reasons to be near her. This was new for him, in a way he did not spend energy evaluating, because it was simply true. She was working on his camp records. She had offered, on the second day, to cross-reference the hunting column's movement data against the Northern Range's existing border records, and he had accepted, and now there was a stack of his archival material on the camp table, and Wren was working through it with the same quiet attention she brought to everything. He found reasons to be at the same table. On the morning of the 4th day, before the news came that the column had cleared the valley, he was sitting across from her while she worked, and she was reading something aloud to him, a notation from the prior year's border survey, and midway through a sentence she stopped. He said, "What is it?" She held the record out. Her finger was on a line. He read it. It was an entry in his own camp record. It was a notation from the hunt disturbance 3 weeks ago. It identified the circumstances under which Pip's parent pack had been fragmented and noted that one adult female wolf, traveling alone, had been reported moving south of the border markers in the days immediately following the disturbance. The notation placed her direction of travel as toward the borderland settlement where Wren lived. Wren said quietly, "She came south, Pip's mother. She came looking for her pup in the only direction she knew to go." Theron said nothing. "She would have come to the settlement," Wren said. "She would have been in the borderland inside of 2 days. But she would not have known to look for a limestone outcrop. She would not have had my mother's notes." She set the record down. "We need to go back to the settlement. If Pip's mother is still in the borderland. My scouts are already tracking her," he said. "I sent them yesterday when I read that entry." Wren looked at him. "You read it yesterday?" "Yes. And you did not tell me. I wanted to be certain before I told you. I did not want to give you a hope that was uncertain." She considered this for a long moment. He watched her and understood that she was deciding whether this was a treatment she accepted, whether being protected from uncertain information was something she wanted, and he could see, from the set of her mouth, that she was going to tell him the answer was no, which was correct, and which he had expected. "In the future," she said, "uncertain information is still information. I would rather have it." "Understood," he said. She held his gaze for a beat. Then she nodded and looked back at the record. "In the future," she said, and he understood what she was doing with that phrase, which was the same thing he was doing with it. Neither of them was saying it directly, but both of them were building the same structure. He let it stand. Selah found him that evening, at the edge of the camp, where he had a habit of standing when the light went. She stood beside him, without preamble, and said, "She is Merrin's daughter." "Yes. You knew." "She told me." Selah was quiet for a moment. "Her scent has changed since she got here. You know that." He did know that. He had been trying not to examine it with too much attention, the way you do not look directly at a bright thing that is still resolving into its full shape. Her fear scent was gone, had been gone since the first night, when warmth and food and the pup's steadying had worked their ordinary medicine on the body's alarm systems. What had replaced it was something else, something that was still distress in its outermost note, but layered, complex, carrying undertones he had no clean name for, except that they intensified when he was near her and did not subside when he moved away. He said, I know. Sela said, Does she know? He thought about the question with honesty. She is beginning to. She will not say it first, Sela said. That is not how she is built. No, Theron said. I know that too. The scouts found Pip's mother on the 5th morning, 2 miles inside the borderland, traveling in a loose pattern that spoke of searching rather than fleeing. She was still alive, still moving, and she came to the call the scouts made, with a trust that told Theron she had not been harmed by the hunters. She was thin, she was exhausted. She moved like something that had been maintaining hope past the reasonable expectation of its continued supply, and when they brought her north toward the ridge camp, she made no sound that he could hear, but he could feel, even at 50 yards, what she was carrying. Wren brought Pip out. He watched from across the camp. He did not move closer. This was not the kind of moment that needed witnesses. It was the kind that needed to be left alone to be itself. He watched Wren kneel in the frost. Familiar posture, deliberate choice, with the pup in her arms. And he watched what happened when the pup registered the scent and made the sound she made. And he watched Wren's face while it happened. And he put it away in the part of himself that did not require anything from it, just held it. When she stood and came back to him, she had the look of someone who had finished something, not finished in the sense of done, finished in the sense of arrived at the reason the thing was worth starting. Her eyes were bright. She had been crying, he could tell, from the quality of her voice when she said, simply, she found her. Yes, he said. You sent the scouts yesterday. Yes. She looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them said what the moment was, because it did not need to be said. It was already in the air between them, legible as iron and cedar, and they both knew it. On the 7th day, Corvin arrived at the ridge camp to negotiate, because the hunting column had cleared his valley. His pack had spent a week without its record keeper, and the Alpha King of the Northern Range had sent 3 formal messages that he could not continue to ignore. He arrived with 2 sentinels, and the particular energy of a man who has been losing a situation gradually and has decided to arrive in person before the losing becomes official. He saw Wren at the camp table. He saw her surrounded by the Northern Range's archival records, wearing a borrowed Northern Range coat, with a small wolf pup sleeping in a nesting box at her left elbow. He saw Theron standing behind her, not threateningly, not demonstratively, simply standing where he stood, with the naturalness of someone who has become accustomed to where things are. Corvin said, Wren, you are needed at the settlement. She said, Good morning, Elder. She was still looking at the record in front of her. I will be returning when the Alpha King and I have completed the border survey cross-reference, approximately 2 days. Corvin looked at Theron. Theron said nothing. He simply let the silence run, which was a skill he had developed over 11 years of dealing with men who needed silences filled. Corvin said, She is my pack's record keeper. Her presence here, without pack sanction. She is a guest, Theron said. She is here by her own choice, and she will leave by her own choice. She is an Omega, Corvin said, and said it in the way people say things they consider final, a category that closes the argument, a nature that determines the outcome. Wren set down her pen. She did not stand. She said, I drew the hunting column 2 miles south and 6 hours east of the limestone outcrop, where the Northern Range pup had been denning alone for 22 days. I did this by chaining myself to an ash root with iron restraints that I fashioned and locked myself, in temperatures that reduced my hand function below operational threshold, and then providing the column's lead hunter with a false location that bought sufficient time for the Alpha King's scouts to secure the pup and for the column to be redirected. This is logged, she touched the notebook, in full, with times and dates and physical condition assessments. She picked up her pen again. If there is a formal objection to my having done this, I am happy to record it. The shelter was very quiet. Theron kept his face still. His wolf said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Davin, in the far corner, had found something extremely interesting to examine on the floor near his feet. Selah, near the fire, had gone entirely motionless in the particular way she went motionless when she was paying the most attention. Corvin looked between Ren and Theron, and something moved through his face. The calculation of a man remapping terrain he had assumed he understood. And then he looked only at Theron and said, "There is the matter of the pack's border position. I came to negotiate the Northern Ranges' support." "Then let us negotiate," Theron said, and gestured to the seat across the table. "Ren will take the record." Corvin sat. He sat across from an Omega record keeper, whose wrists were wrapped in Northern Range bandaging, and who had her pen already raised, and he did not say another word about her rank, because he was a man who understood when the ground had shifted, even if he had not yet decided what to call the new configuration. The negotiation took 4 hours. Ren recorded everything. Twice Theron paused and looked at her notes rather than at Corvin, and she pointed twice to discrepancies she had marked in the margin where the elder's current claims differed from the prior year's record, and both times Corvin revised his position. He was not a man who enjoyed being corrected, but the margins were meticulous and undeniable, and eventually the meticulous and undeniable wins. When it was over, and Corvin and his sentinels had gone to the camp's guest quarters, Theron stood with Ren in the cleared shelter, and she was closing the record book with the precise, unhurried movements of someone winding down a long day, and he said, "You knew he would come." "I assumed he is consistent." She straightened the stack of records. "The border concessions in the 3rd clause are better than what he has held for the last 6 years. He will not like them. He will accept them. Because of you." She looked at him with a quality of resistance that he recognized as not disagreement exactly, but the reflex of someone who had been trained by experience not to claim too much. "Because the records are accurate," she said. "Ren." She was quiet. "You are not invisible here," he said. She held his gaze for a long time. In it, he could see all the years the word had taken to build, not dramatic injury, nothing that could be named easily, simply the long, steady accumulation of not being looked at, of speaking into rooms that did not turn, of knowing things that went unasked, because no one thought to ask her. He could see the weight of it, and he could see her carrying it with the same uprightness she carried everything, and he could see that she did not know, yet, what to do with a room that turned. "You will," he said. He was not making a promise. He was making a fact, the same way he made most facts, without flourish, as a statement of what was already true, and only needed the world to catch up to it. She looked down at the record book. Her hand rested on the cover, and he watched her fingers, still slightly stiff at the knuckles, the cold's last gift, fading now, press flat against it, as if she were taking its temperature. The claiming mark was not yet between them. It would not be rushed. There was a great deal of talking still to do, and ground still to walk, and things she would need to say in her own time, in her own words, and he understood this was not the end of the distance between them, but the beginning of its slow and willing collapse, which was a different thing entirely. She said finally, "The pup. When her mother is strong enough to travel, what happens?" "They go back north, to the pack." "And Pip?" "Is named Pip now, apparently," he said, "and goes with her mother, when her mother is ready. Unless she decides otherwise." He paused. "Some pups choose their own directions." Ren almost smiled. He saw the edge of it before she turned away, and he decided it was the best thing he had seen in a very long time. Outside, the moon was up. Not full, a few days from full, the light coming down through the tent, opening at an angle that put a pale bar of it across the camp table, across the record books, across the hand she still had, flat on the cover. Silver and cold and completely honest. He stood in it, and she stood in it, and neither of them moved, and the distance between them was small enough now to name. The days after that had a different quality, not simpler, but clarified, the way a room looks after someone opens a window. Wren went back to the Pack settlement on the 9th day, as she had said she would, not because the situation required it, but because she had things to collect. Her mother's field notes, the compass, the small record books she kept in the back of her wardrobe, which held 11 years of marginal annotations that no one had read. She also told Corvin she was resigning her position as Pack record keeper, in a conversation that was brief and even, and that she recorded herself, in triplicate, before she left. Corvin said very little. There was not much to say. The ground had shifted. The new configuration had a name now, and he was a man who understood territory. She came back north with what she needed, in a pack that was not heavy. She walked through the camp, and people looked at her, which she was learning to receive, without turning her head away. Davin held a door for her. It was a door that was not usually held. He did not comment on this, and neither did she, but she felt it as she passed through, the small, plain gesture that said she was not being seen the way she had been seen before, which was the genre's central promise, delivered not as spectacle, but as a door on a hinge swinging open. Theron was at the table with his scouts when she came in. He looked up. He did not say her name, or cross the room, or do anything that required narrating. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her, with the full attention of someone for whom she was not invisible and had never been invisible, not since the moment the wind shifted and her scent came in on it. The fear and the cold and the deliberate sacrifice, and underneath it all, the thing that was hers, the quality he still did not have a word for in any language he spoke. She set her pack down. She took out her mother's field notes and put them on the table. "I thought you might want to read the Northern Range sections," she said. She knew the limestone territory better than your current scouts. There are 3 den sites she catalogued that I do not see in your existing records. He looked at the book, and then at her. "Thank you," he said. She sat down and opened her own notebook. Pip was in her nesting box and stirring, making the small, purposeful sound she made when she had decided it was time to be awake. The scouts were reading maps. Outside, the moon was 2 days from full. The fire was burning, and the shelter was warm, and the pup was making sounds that were alive. Wren wrote in her notebook the time, and the date, and the condition of the pup, and the quality of the light, and she wrote, in the margin, in the small letters she used for things she was not ready to say aloud, "This is enough. This is more than enough." That was the night he claimed her. Not that night in practice. In practice there were months of walking and talking, and disagreement, and the kind of closeness that builds between 2 precise people who have decided, without either of them saying so directly, that the distance has become intolerable. But that was the night she wrote those words in the margin, and he saw her write them, and he did not ask what they said, and she did not offer, and they both knew what they were. The mating mark came in late autumn, on a night that smelled of cedar smoke and frozen ground, and the particular sharp sweet quality that their combined scent had been building toward for months. An inevitability, in the most literal biological sense, the mark site on her neck, that had been aching since the wind shifted 9 weeks ago, warming at last to something it could become. It was not a spectacle, it was a fact, the kind of fact that the world catches up to. By spring, Pip was fat and wild, and had decided, as Theron had predicted, on her own direction, which was to live in the camp as though she owned it, and accept worship from the scouts as her natural due. Her mother had been given her own choice, and had made it. She stayed north, near enough to visit, which she did with a frequency that made the pup absurd with joy. By summer, Wren's mother's field notes had been formally incorporated into the Northern Ranges Territorial Archive, credited correctly, cited in the first record review, in which Wren sat, not at the back, but at the table. By the following winter, she was writing in a new notebook, a thicker one, with better binding, a thing Theron had found in the capital's record hall and brought back without ceremony, setting it on the table in front of her one morning, without explanation, which was how he gave things, and she had picked it up and run her thumb across the cover and said nothing, which was how she received them. Inside the front cover, in letters only a little larger than her margin notes, she wrote, Wren, Northern Range, Field Record, Year 1, Year 1, as if the years before had been prologue, and this was the beginning of the account that mattered, the one that would be read, the one that would be cited by someone, some day, who needed to find a den that everyone else had stopped looking for. On the table beside the notebook, in a nesting box she had outgrown and refused to vacate, Pip slept in the oblique winter light, with her tail over her nose, and her sides moving in the easy rhythm of something that was warm and fed and safe, and the fire was burning, and outside the snow was doing what snow does, and it was enough. It was more than enough.